This set of notes is titled Elections and Government in Virginia. So as we go through these notes, we're kind of trying to take a wide look at a lot of different aspects of what was going on in colonial Virginia, starting with Jamestown. And we've taken a look so far at the tobacco economy. We've talked about slavery and the slave trade. So for this one, we're going to really look at the birth of democracy in the English colonies, which again started here in Virginia. So, important to understand that the first form of government in Virginia was not a democracy. They didn't just show up and have a democracy. And this original form of government turned out to not really be all that successful. How it was set up was the king in England gave authority to the Virginia Company. And so you've got this Virginia Company, which is based in England, that is in charge of the colony. The company selected a council, a handful of gentlemen, right, to go over to Virginia and be in charge, right? And so these are going to be, wealthier, more aristocracy types who aren't really going to want to work hard. They're not really going to want to do the hard physical labor that's needed. And so they didn't really get along, right? The more average colonist wasn't really wild about them because they didn't really work very much. They fought with each other over who would make the decisions and who would have the most power. So simply having a council wasn't very effective. So the Virginia Company decided, well, what we need is one strong leader to be in charge. We'll keep the council, but we're going to appoint a governor. And the governor, his say is final, right? So no more bickering in the council about who's going to make the decisions. The governor is the top dog, and the council can help him, right? They'll advise him, they'll give him some ideas, but ultimately the governor is in charge. And that helped out some. An important step came in 1619 when the council decided they would add an elected assembly. They wanted to get some input from the colonists. And so they created what was called the House of Burgesses. This became the very first elected body in the American colonies. House of Burgesses today, think about, the House of Delegates here in Virginia, or the House of Representatives in Congress in Washington. This was the predecessor of that, the very first elected body. How it worked was each county, and remember by this point, it wasn't just Jamestown. Colony had started to grow, more settlements were popping up. So each county in Virginia held an election, and they would choose 2 burgesses, or representatives, to go to the capital and represent them. So who could vote? Every free white landholder could vote as long as you showed up for the election. And when I say white landholder, you had to have a minimum of 25 acres. So you had to be a free white landholder, minimum of 25 acres. So fairly wealthy, right? So if you were a servant, an indentured servant, or if you were poorer and just had a small bit of land, you wouldn't be eligible. If you were a woman, not eligible. African American, not eligible, right? Only wealthier white men were eligible. So what did it look like, right? When we think of elections today, we often think of pretty orderly affairs, right? Like these people standing in line patiently to vote, right? When they go inside to vote, it looks something like this, right? It's quiet, people are casting their ballots, secretly, and unless you tell anyone, no one's going to know how you voted. Well, it wasn't quite like that back then. In fact, here's a picture painted by a guy named George Caleb Bingham titled County Election. And as you can see, if you kind of look closely here, you've got the courthouse building and what looks like an official standing on the steps, registering votes. But all around are all kinds of things happening. There's people, chatting. There's people who appear to be a little bit tipsy. There even, along the left, seems to be a guy pouring someone a drink, right? This was a very social, very loud, very boisterous affair. You would vote at the county courthouse, and the county sheriff was in charge of running the election. You didn't vote in secret. In fact, you voted orally. You voted out loud by telling the sheriff your choice, so everyone could hear who you were voting for. That included the candidates, who usually were sitting next to the sheriff and would know whether or not you voted for them. Well, that can be a little bit awkward if the candidates happen to be two people that you know, two people that you like. Maybe your friend is one candidate and your neighbor is another. So that could be pretty awkward. And sometimes candidates would try to sway the election in their favor by treating the voters to rum or maybe some beer in order to gain their support. So these were kind of wild affairs. At the end of the day, almost all of the leaders of the House of Burgesses ended up being large landholders, right? The wealthy. Almost all of them were college educated, members of the Anglican Church or the Church of England. Almost all of them were tobacco planters who had a lot of slaves. And in fact, a lot of times the leaders were friends and relatives. They were very connected to each other. There were three major families, the Carter family, the Lee family, and the Randolph family, where about half of the people elected early on came from those three families. So this wasn't really like, anyone and everyone got elected, right? It was typically the wealthy, the educated. And at the end of the day, the assembly didn't have a ton of power. It could suggest laws. It could discuss laws that the governor was thinking about. But anything that it voted in favor of, the governor could simply veto it, right? So they could say, we want this to happen. And if the governor didn't like it, he could simply say no. So early on, the House of Burgesses did not have that much power. So for the response question, I want you to think about that. If the House of Burgesses didn't have that much power, why was it such a big deal, right? Why do we still talk about it today? Why was it so important? And I want you to connect it to at least one or more of our 5 ideals, right? OLDER, opportunity, liberty, democracy, equality, and rights. You don't have to talk about all 5, but connect it to at least one. Try to connect it to more than one. Why was it such a big deal? Make sure you print your notes before the next class.